The clock just ran out, and the Middle East will never be the same. Right now, as you're watching this, something unprecedented is unfolding in Tehran, something the mainstream media either can't process or won't tell you the truth about. The Ayatollah has reportedly fled the capital as protesters flood the streets, and Trump's final ultimatum has reached its deadline. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't just another news cycle about Iran. This is the culmination of decades of covert operations, economic warfare, and a complete restructuring of global power dynamics that's been accelerating since the Abraham Accords. What we're witnessing is the potential collapse of the Islamic Republic's grip on power, a regime that's been the cornerstone of resistance against Western hegemony in the region for over 40 years. The timing isn't coincidental. Trump's warning, the protests, the alleged flight of Iran's supreme leader, these are all pressure points in a much larger game involving oil markets, the petrodollar system, and America's strategic realignment in the Middle East. The question isn't whether change is coming to Iran. The question is, who benefits from the chaos and what comes next for a region that's been the world's geopolitical chessboard for generations? Let me be very direct with you about what's happening right now, because if you're relying on the evening news or even most alternative media outlets, you're getting maybe 10% of the actual story. What we're seeing in Tehran isn't spontaneous combustion of public anger, though there's certainly genuine grievance fueling these protests. What we're witnessing is the final act of a drama that's been carefully choreographed over multiple administrations through both Republican and Democratic presidencies, and it's reaching its crescendo precisely when the geopolitical stars have aligned in a way that makes regime change not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. Think back to what Trump actually said in his warning to Iran. It wasn't the typical diplomatic language we've become numb to over the years. It was specific, it was personal, and it carried the weight of someone who understands that in the Middle East words are weapons and ultimatums are contracts written in blood. Trump's approach to Iran has always been fundamentally different from the Obama-era strategy of appeasement and the nuclear deal. He walked away from the JCPOA not because he's a warmonger, as the critics claimed, but because he understood something that the foreign policy establishment refused to acknowledge. You cannot negotiate with a regime that views compromise as weakness and sees every concession as an invitation to push further. The Ayatollah fleeing Tehran, if these reports are accurate, represents something far more significant than just one man leaving a city. Ayatollah Khamenei isn't simply a political leader or even just a religious figure. He is the embodiment of the Islamic Revolution itself. He is the successor to Khomeini, the guardian of the revolutionary ideology that has defined Iran for over 4 decades. For him to flee the capital is tantamount to admitting that the entire structure, the entire revolutionary project, is collapsing. It's like watching the Tsar flee St. Petersburg in 1917 or the Shah fleeing Tehran in 1979. These aren't just political events, they're civilizational inflection points. But let's dig deeper into why this is happening now, and not 5 years ago or 5 years from now. The answer lies in understanding the economic strangulation that's been applied to Iran with surgical precision. The sanctions regime that Trump reimposed after abandoning the nuclear deal wasn't just about preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. That was the public justification, the story sold to the international community. The real objective was to systematically dismantle Iran's ability to project power across the Middle East, to fund its proxy networks in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and ultimately to make the cost of maintaining the Islamic Republic so unbearable that either the regime would collapse from within or the population would rise up and tear it down. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the economic warfare against Iran intersects with something much larger that's happening in global finance. Iran has been one of the primary nations attempting to circumvent the dollar-based international financial system. Together with Russia, China, and other nations in what we might call the resistance axis, Iran has been working to create alternative payment systems, to trade oil in currencies other than dollars, and to build economic structures that operate outside Western control. This isn't just about Iran's survival, it's about the future architecture of the global financial system. If Iran falls, if the Islamic Republic is replaced by a government that's willing to reintegrate into the Western economic order, that's a massive victory not just for American foreign policy, but for the maintenance of dollar hegemony. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening on the streets of Tehran, because the mainstream narrative is going to be incredibly simplistic. They're going to tell you that the Iranian people are rising up against oppression, that they're demanding freedom and democracy, and that this is a purely organic expression of popular will. And yes, there is genuine suffering in Iran. The economy has been devastated. inflation is rampant, young people see no future, women are tired of being told what to wear and how to behave. All of that is real and all of that rage is legitimate, but to pretend that there aren't external actors amplifying this rage, organizing these protests, and providing both the infrastructure and the strategic guidance to turn anger into revolution, that's either naive or deliberately dishonest. The United States has been conducting covert operations inside Iran for decades. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented fact. The CIA, working through various front organizations and in coordination with allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, has been supporting dissident groups, funding opposition media, and creating the conditions for exactly what we're seeing now. Does that make the protests illegitimate? Not necessarily. Does it mean the grievances aren't real? Of course not. But it does mean that what we're watching is hybrid warfare, a carefully calibrated combination of economic pressure, information operations, and support for internal opposition, all designed to achieve a strategic objective that couldn't be achieved through conventional military means. Consider the timing of Trump's ultimatum and its expiration. Trump understands leverage, and he understands negotiation in a way that career diplomats often don't. When he sets a deadline, he's not just making noise for domestic political consumption. He's creating a psychological pressure point, a moment when decisions must be made and consequences become real. The expiration of his warning coinciding with this uprising isn't coincidence, it's orchestration. It's designed to send a message to the Iranian leadership: your time is up, your options have run out, and what comes next is entirely dependent on whether you're willing to fundamentally change course or whether you're prepared to go down with the ship. But here's the question that nobody in the mainstream media is asking: what comes after the Islamic Republic? Because regime change is easy, building something stable and functional in the aftermath is extraordinarily difficult, as we learned painfully in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. Iran isn't some tribal society with no history of centralized government. Iran is an ancient civilization with deep cultural roots, a sophisticated population, and a complex array of ethnic and religious groups that have competing interests and grievances. The Islamic Republic, for all its brutality and dysfunction, has been the glue holding these factions together for over 40 years. Remove that glue, and what do you get? Do you get a peaceful transition to democracy, or do you get Yugoslavia-style fragmentation and civil war? The neoconservative vision for Iran has always been naive in the extreme. They imagine that once the mullahs are gone, Iran will naturally evolve into a pro-Western democracy that plays nice with Israel and Saudi Arabia and becomes a reliable partner for American interests in the region. But that fantasy ignores the deep nationalist sentiment in Iran, the historical memory of Western interference and exploitation, and the complex relationship between religion, politics, and national identity that defines Iranian society. Even Iranians who despise the Islamic Republic aren't necessarily pro-American. Even Iranians who want social and political freedom aren't necessarily willing to become a vassal state of Washington. This is where Trump's approach might actually be different from the neoconservative playbook, and it's worth paying attention to. Trump has never shown much interest in nation building or trying to remake foreign societies in America's image. His instinct is transactional: make a deal, establish clear rules, and enforce consequences when those rules are broken. If a post-revolutionary Iran were to emerge, Trump's inclination would likely be to negotiate a new relationship based on mutual interests rather than trying to impose democracy at gunpoint. That's a more realistic approach, though whether it's the approach that actually prevails depends on who has Trump's ear and what factions within the American foreign policy establishment manage to assert control over the process. Let's also consider the regional implications, because Iran's potential collapse sends shockwaves far beyond its borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon has been almost entirely dependent on Iranian funding and weapons. If that lifeline is cut, what happens to Hezbollah's ability to threaten Israel and maintain its grip on Lebanese politics? The Assad regime in Syria has survived largely because of Iranian support, along with Russian intervention. If Iran collapses, does Assad fall shortly thereafter? The Houthis in Yemen have been fighting Saudi Arabia with Iranian backing. Do they suddenly find themselves without ammunition and resources? And what about the various Shia militia groups in Iraq that have been Iran's primary mechanism for maintaining influence over Iraqi politics? The answer to all of these questions is that we're potentially looking at a complete restructuring of Middle Eastern power dynamics. Saudi Arabia and the UAE would become the unchallenged Sunni powers in the region. Israel would no longer face an existential threat from an Iranian nuclear program or Iranian-backed militias on its borders. Turkey might move to fill the vacuum in some areas, particularly in Syria and Iraq, which creates its own set of complications. And Russia, which has been Iran's primary great power patron, would lose a crucial partner in its effort to challenge American dominance in the Middle East. But here's where it gets even more complex, and this is something that the simplistic good guys versus bad guys narrative completely misses. A complete Iranian collapse isn't necessarily in anyone's interest, including America's. Iran has been a useful bogeyman, a unifying threat that justifies massive military spending, that keeps the Gulf states dependent on American security guarantees, and that provides a rationale for maintaining a large American military presence in the region. Without Iran as an enemy, what justifies keeping tens of thousands of American troops in the Middle East? What justifies the billions in military aid to Israel and the Gulf states? What keeps OPEC aligned with American interests? This is the paradox of American foreign policy in the Middle East. We say we want peace and stability, but the entire system is built on managed chaos and permanent crisis. The military-industrial complex doesn't profit from peace. It profits from endless preparation for war. The intelligence agencies don't justify their budgets by solving problems. They justify them by identifying threats. And the foreign policy establishment doesn't maintain its relevance by achieving lasting solutions. It maintains relevance by ensuring that problems persist and require expert management. So, when we see the Ayatollah reportedly fleeing Tehran and protesters taking to the streets, we need to ask ourselves, is this actually the end of the Islamic Republic, or is this another chapter in a much longer game? Is this regime change, or is this a pressure campaign designed to force concessions and behavioral change without actually toppling the entire system? Because there's a big difference between wanting Iran to stop supporting terrorism and destabilizing its neighbors, and wanting Iran to cease to exist as an independent regional power. Trump's warning to Iran needs to be understood in this context. Trump isn't an ideologue committed to remaking the Middle East according to some grand vision. He's a dealmaker who wants leverage and wants outcomes that serve American interests without requiring endless military commitments and nation-building projects. His warning was likely designed to create exactly this kind of crisis moment, where the Iranian leadership has to make a fundamental choice. Change your behavior and we can do business, or continue on your current path and face complete economic and political collapse. The reports of the Ayatollah fleeing suggest that the Iranian leadership has reached the point where they're not sure they can survive this pressure. But flight doesn't necessarily mean the end. It could be a tactical retreat, a way to regroup and reassess while loyalist forces try to regain control of the situation. The Islamic Republic has survived protests before. It survived the Green Movement in 2009. It survived the economic protests in 2017 and 2018. What makes this moment different is the combination of factors. The economic devastation is more severe. The international isolation is more complete. The internal divisions within the regime are more pronounced, and the external pressure from the United States and its allies is more coordinated and sustained. But even if the Islamic Republic falls, even if we see a revolutionary transition to a new government, the fundamental questions about Iran's role in the region and its relationship with the West remain unresolved. Iran will still be a nation of 85 million people with significant oil and gas reserves, strategic geography, and legitimate security concerns. It will still be bordered by countries with which it has complex and often hostile relationships. It will still be home to multiple ethnic and religious groups with their own aspirations and grievances. Changing the government doesn't magically solve these underlying realities. What we're really witnessing is the latest phase in a century-long struggle over who controls the Middle East and on what terms. The British and the Russians played this game in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Americans and the Soviets played it during the Cold War. Now we're in a multipolar world where the United States is still the dominant military power but faces challenges from rising players like China, a resurgent Russia, and regional powers that have their own ambitions. Iran under the Islamic Republic positioned itself as the leader of resistance to American hegemony in the region. A post-revolutionary Iran might take a different approach, but it won't abandon Iran's national interests or its aspirations to be a significant regional player. The final warning from Trump, then, isn't just about this specific moment or this specific crisis. It's a statement about American expectations for how regional powers should behave and what consequences they'll face if they don't comply. It's a demonstration of American willingness to use economic warfare as a tool of statecraft. And it's a test case for whether the United States can achieve strategic objectives through coercion and pressure without resorting to large-scale military intervention. For those of us watching from outside, trying to understand what's really happening beneath the surface of the news headlines, This moment in Tehran represents something profound. It represents the potential end of a revolutionary project that has defined Middle Eastern politics for over 40 years. It represents a possible shift in the regional balance of power that could reshape alliances and conflicts for decades to come. And it represents a critical test of whether the American model of hybrid warfare, combining economic sanctions, covert operations, and support for internal opposition, can successfully topple a determined adversary without massive military commitment. The protesters in the streets of Tehran are real people with real grievances who are risking their lives for a better future. Their courage deserves respect regardless of what external forces may be supporting or exploiting their movement. But we also need to see the bigger picture, to understand the geopolitical chess game being played, and to recognize that what happens in Iran over the coming days and weeks will have consequences that ripple far beyond that country's borders. This is about oil markets and nuclear proliferation, about the future of the Middle East and the maintenance of American global power, about the clash between sovereignty and hegemony, and about whether nations can chart their own course or must ultimately bend to the will of more powerful actors. Trump's final warning has expired, and now we wait to see what comes next. Will the Islamic Republic survive this challenge as it has survived others, or is this truly the beginning of the end? Will a new Iran emerge that's willing to negotiate a new relationship with the West, or will we see chaos and fragmentation that makes the current crisis look mild by comparison? And most importantly, will American policymakers learn the lessons of past interventions and approach whatever comes next with realism and humility, or will we repeat the mistakes that have characterized American Middle East policy for generations? The answers to these questions will define not just Iran's future, but the future of the entire region and America's role in shaping it.